Welcome to Chat with the Lawyer. I'm your host, Walla Blagay, and we are honored to have Professor Jenny Roberts from American University, Washington College of Law. And she's a professor there, and today she's going to talk about the criminal justice system, expungement, and pretty much reentry programs. And we're going to talk a lot about the laws in Maryland and how it compares with other states. So this is going to be a very interesting show and very timely. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, well, of course. Now tell us a little bit about what you've done, your practice and all.
Sure. So right now I'm a professor at American University, Washington College of Law, and I co-direct our criminal justice clinic. And I work specifically in the criminal defense portion of that. There's a prosecution part of that, which is taught by somebody else. And so my students are in Montgomery County, Maryland, representing people charged mostly with misdemeanors in district court. But we also do a lot of what would be characterized as reentry work, because a lot of our clients end up with many issues coming out of the lower criminal courts relating to employment, to housing, sometimes to family law matters. So it's much broader than you would think.
Interesting. Well, now let's jump right into it. Let's talk about our criminal justice system. I know you've been studying that, working on that. So tell us the state of that, especially in the state of Maryland.
Well, I do have a few thoughts on the criminal justice system nationwide and in Maryland. So right now we're at a sort of historic moment because violent crime has gone down and continues to go down across the nation in almost all jurisdictions. Yet our numbers for criminal records and incarceration keep going up. So you might wonder why. What is that about? Well, a big part of the story, which we really don't talk enough about, are this low-level stuff that's going on and that's kind of churning through the courts. So misdemeanors, quality of life crimes, on up to all sorts of misdemeanors, drug possession misdemeanors, loitering, trespass. Those are the kinds of cases that in most jurisdictions, they can make up more than 75% of what's coming through the criminal justice system. And I don't think people realize the numbers there. And there are a lot of reasons for that, which I can talk about later if you're interested.
Right, and let's just to go into that for a quick. I know they're talking in New York. There seems to be police have sort of moved back from arresting because of the recent incidents, recent killings, and some of the response was, well, it was over policing anywhere because crime hasn't risen. So is there an over policing issue here if such high misdemeanors?
Well, there's a lot of issues, I think. One is it's not just over-policing, but it's where police choose to police. And there are different ways of looking at that. There are communities that say we want the police here, and that's totally understandable.
Right.
But those same communities are going to suffer if a lot of people in that community end up with some kind of criminal record. So here's a shocking statistic, for example. And this is pretty widely reported based on FBI reports and statistics, that between 70 and 100 million people in the United States, and that's almost 1 in 3 people in the United States, has some sort of criminal record.
Wow, that's a large number.
That's a pretty shocking number. It shocks me every time I read it or say it or think about it. And so that means, just to be clear, not necessarily a conviction record, but some kind of arrest or conviction record. So some of them are arrests that end up getting dismissed, or arrests that never even make it into a courthouse. So you have to think about the criminal justice system in that light. And so there are really three things I would say that are important to think about. One is just the number of people getting arrested and the number of convictions and where that leaves us as a nation. So I recently worked on a report for the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers on some of these issues, and one of the questions asked in the report and from the task force was, are we really a nation of criminals? I don't think we are, but we have made ourselves one in a lot of ways. So that's one big issue, and I would call that mass criminalization. I mean, without a doubt, we have a mass incarceration problem, and that's the one we hear about more, but mass criminalization is a real crisis right now. There are two other things that I think are important to remember. One is technology and sort of where that leaves us, because maybe 30 years ago, if you had a lot of people with an arrest record, if an employer wanted to know about it, they kind of had to go down to the local courthouse and look it up.
Wow.
And now, they can buy it from a private background screener. They can go onto the online court database, which reports even non-convictions in many states.
And can we just, because I know a lot of people go on Maryland Case Search,
Yep.
look at people's
That's
names.
what I'm talking
How
about.
long does it stay on there? Does it stay there forever?
It's there forever unless you have a right to expunge it, and I know we're going to talk about that in a little while. Very narrow right in Maryland, but otherwise it's there for anybody to see. Yes. And then the third prong of this, just to finish answering your question about sort of the state of the criminal justice system, and that's nationwide and in Maryland, is the collateral consequences of criminal convictions. So just at the same time that sort of numbers of criminal records are exploding and numbers of, the effects that this has on people is also exploding. And so those are the so-called collateral consequences. So I'll give you an example. If you have a conviction and that leads to your deportation, or it leads to your loss of public housing, or it leads to your loss of a business license so you can run your small business, that's called a collateral consequence. Now, most people aren't going to experience that as very collateral. They're going to see that as really punitive.
Right.
But that's not how the criminal justice system deals with it. In fact, it largely doesn't deal with these consequences at all. And those have just taken off in numbers. So there's a new American Bar Association created database, and there are more than 45,000 consequences listed nationwide in the database. Again, these are all shocking numbers. And so when you put together numbers of people with arrest records, you put that with technology and the ease of accessing those records, and you put that together with all these formal and informal collateral consequences of a criminal conviction, it's a crisis in this country.
Right, interesting. So let's go into the work that you do with misdemeanors and what you do right now. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, in terms of the students, so in a clinic, as you well know, having been in the general practice clinic at American University, students can practice depending on what jurisdiction they're in. Maryland allows students to practice under what's called a student practice order. So they're student attorneys. Now, obviously, I supervise them, but they're fabulous, and they work really hard for their clients, and they're most of them are very close to becoming licensed attorneys, and so they represent people under the student practice order in misdemeanor cases in Montgomery County, and we do some juvenile cases in one semester, and then some adult cases. And so we're in Montgomery County largely, almost exclusively in the lower court.
Oh, okay. And can people contact you if they feel they want to actually go through your program, as in clients?
So there is a general intake process for all of the clinical programs at American, and we have 10 clinics, and they span, there's the general practice clinic, which handles a wide variety of cases, an immigration clinic, a domestic violence clinic, a women in the law clinic, intellectual property, community and economic development. I'm sorry, I'm going to stop there, but I'm definitely leaving some of my colleagues out. But so if somebody were to call with a problem, because lawyers are, after all, problem solvers. That's what our job is, to help somebody with a problem they have. If they were to call the general number, then they might be able to go into the intake process for one of the clinics. The criminal justice clinic, we get our clients, if they will have our representation, if they wish to have our representation, through the Office of the Public Defender. Okay. So if somebody is indigent and charged in anywhere in Maryland with a crime that's incarcerable, then they're going to end up being directed to the public defender's office, and some very small number of them will then end up in our clinic.
Okay. Now, can you talk? Also, you've written books and articles about the sort of the high numbers of misdemeanors. So, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So, my research focuses on a few different areas. Misdemeanors and the lower criminal courts is one area I've written a lot about. a lot of what I was just talking about, sort of the high numbers and the way that even a misdemeanor conviction or arrest can have a huge effect on a person's life, really knock them out of the workplace. Okay. And sometimes out of the housing market. And these are things we don't want as a country.
Right,
I mean, the police don't want it. They're very clear about that. The corrections
right.
officials don't want it. So it's a time in this country to really rethink our approach to low-level crime policing and where those cases end up and whether they should even be cases at all.
Right. And so can you give us an example, because we want people to see sort of how this does knock someone off.
Sure.
Sometimes it's hard for people to see that something so small can end in someone losing their job. So can you give us examples?
So as you know, I can't talk about any specific
right.
client unless the client were to give permission or come on to the show, which
right.
might be an interesting future show.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll do sort of a composite, okay?
Right.
So a typical example, and these are, I'm drawing examples that are made up of different cases that my students have worked on or that I worked on as a public defender in Manhattan, where I practiced before becoming a law professor. So a disorderly conduct. Misdemeanor, can't face a lot of jail time in Maryland.
Explain what's disorderly conduct. What example?
So would be, standing in a crowded area, and maybe it's somebody who's drunk and acting in a very loud manner, and harassing or annoying public that is around that person. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that every disorderly conduct case that comes into court is really a disorderly conduct case. We see a lot of those cases where, it's late at night on a sort of deserted street somewhere, and I wonder, where is the public annoyance? But that's my criminal defense lawyer hat, and I also think it's the truth.
Right.
But
so arguably, this could be a bunch of college students out drinking loud in the street.
Yeah, it could be. College students are not generally the ones getting arrested for disorderly conduct.
And we understand that. And who is the target?
Well, I mean, as in any system in Maryland, in Montgomery County, anywhere else, it's going to be largely people of color and poor people who are getting arrested for these types of things, particularly in drug cases. And we can talk about that because I know you're familiar with a lot of those issues. Coming from a really great Maryland ACLU report on marijuana arrests. So you see a really disparate effect depending on what community you're in. So you might have a disorderly conduct arrest. Let's say that arrest ends up in a conviction for disorderly conduct for whatever reason. The person doesn't want to go to trial or is convicted after trial or pleads guilty because they're scared to go to trial. There's any number of ways that could play out. That person now, and we have had this person, risks losing his or her public housing. And so we have had to work with people when the public housing authority, depending on their local rules, then sends that person a letter and says, we're troubled by what we're seeing here. The arrest, often the arrest record is what they're looking at, and maybe the arrest was for something more serious, or just the facts of the arrest have called their attention to the case, and so that person then really has to fight for their public housing, and they could lose it under really broad rules that let public housing authorities evict people if they or anyone in their household has been either convicted or had an arrest, or there's some indication of behavior or criminal activity. So that's pretty broad. That same person might then go to apply for a job, and it might be just an entry-level job where their employer says, do you have any convictions? And they say, well, I have this little disorderly conduct. And that employer, especially in this economy, has 100 applications in front of them. That person gets no further in that process. And we certainly see and hear a lot of reports of that problem from our clients. So those are that's just an example.
That's a good example. And can you touch quickly on the ACLU marijuana report?
Sure. So this is, I think, a really important report because everybody knew that marijuana possession cases, everybody meaning people who work within the criminal justice system and certainly people on the street who are getting stopped and charged with it, knew that this was policing that was being done in a racially disproportionate way. And so what the ACLU report did first in a nationwide report called Marijuana in Black and White, and then I think the Maryland one was Maryland Marijuana in Black and White.
Maryland Marijuana in Black and White.
Thank you. So that really studied the issue and proved it.
Right.
So Maryland, sadly, has one of the worst records in terms of the disproportionate way that blacks are charged with marijuana possession. Latinos couldn't even be counted because the statistics aren't reported.
Right.
So the number of whites who are counted is probably even smaller because
Right.
Latinos are counted in with the white population.
Yeah.
So basically what you see is that, I'm going to simplify it a lot, but if you look at marijuana use in the general population, white people, black people use marijuana at very similar rates, and that's been well established for a number of years.
Right.
So what would you expect to find? Well, if we've decided as a society that people need to be arrested for this, and I understand that we're stepping back from that in many states,
Right.
including Maryland, although people are still coming through the lower criminal court with marijuana cases, at least in Montgomery County,
Right.
even though they're not technically crimes,
Right,
but there's
right.
still a record established.
Right.
So even if we're stepping back from that, you would think that if we think it's important for police to stop and search for marijuana, that you would see equal number of arrests for black people and white people, and that's not true.
Right.
So it depends on the jurisdiction.
Right. And we would note that it's higher in Baltimore and Prince George's County, right?
Higher in Baltimore, I'd have to look at the Prince George's County. It's definitely higher, way higher in terms of white and black
Right.
arrest numbers.
Right.
But in Maryland statewide, I believe you're 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession if you're black than if you're white.
Right.
And that's an unacceptable statistic.
Yeah.
So I just, I don't feel comfortable with it. I don't think anyone should feel comfortable with it. But that's the reality. In Baltimore City, I believe it's 8-1.
Yeah.
And sadly, even though I love living in Maryland. I've lived here for 6 years now, and I think there are a lot of great laws in Maryland, and it's a very forward-thinking state in a lot of ways.
Right.
In this way, we're really kind of shameful on the national front because we are, I believe, number 4 on the list of racial disparities in marijuana arrests. DC is first.
Wow. Well, we're gonna stop right now. We're gonna come back, and this is great information. So our next time is gonna be even more interesting. So please stay with us.
Hey! Ooh. Ooh. Baby Eddie, meet.
Baby Maya.
Oh, it's for us.
Your baby's getting text messages?
Yeah, I signed us up for Text for Baby. We get free text messages every week. Look.
A car seat for the hospital. That's a great reminder. How do we sign up?
Text BABY to 511411 and you'll get free health and safety tips every week.
Okay, we're signed up. Look!
That's one smart baby.
Just like her mom.
Welcome back to Chat with the Lawyer. I'm your host, Walla Blagay, and we're having a discussion with Professor Roberts about expungements in the criminal justice system, which has been very informative information. So let's jump right back into it. And let's start talking about actually expungements in Maryland. How does the law work? How does someone get these off their records?
Okay, so Maryland has a fairly limited expungement law. Every state and DC has some mechanism for expunging. Most of them only allow expungement of, everyone allows expungement of non-conviction records, I should say. Maryland is one of those jurisdictions. Some jurisdictions allow expungement of some misdemeanors. Maryland, there's a very small number of misdemeanors on the law, in the expungement law, that you can apply to expunge, but it's very small.
Can you list those?
I can't list them all because, frankly, I've never seen anyone with any of these. Not never seen anyone. I've seen very few people with loitering, vagrancy. There's a couple of drinking in public. Those are the ones that we have seen once in a while. And it could be an ordinance, a municipal ordinance, or state law. And I think most of the things on the list would only be crimes under local law. So generally in Maryland, we're just talking about non-convictions right? That where you can get expungement. Now, there are a bunch of states that allow for expungement of any misdemeanor, always with a few exceptions. There are always exceptions. But most misdemeanors. And now more and more states are passing laws that allow for expungement of certain nonviolent felonies after a passage of time. So, you know, on the national front, if you look at the nation as a whole, we're not the worst, but we are far from the best. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done. So right now, if someone says, I'd like to expunge my criminal record, my criminal conviction, the answer is almost definitely going to be in Maryland. You can't do that if it's a conviction, unless it's one of this very short list of very,
Even
very
if it's
minor.
been time passed?
25, 30, 50,
No.
70 years. Yeah. No. But
Unfortunate.
if you have an arrest that results in a non-conviction, and that includes something in Maryland called a probation before judgment. So even if you're convicted of something in Maryland, and the judge sees that you're deserving of, and they want to give you a chance to have that become a non-conviction, they might grant you a probation before judgment. And that's a really important thing for people to know about, and defense lawyers, of course, know about it and ask for it for clients all the time. So if we in the clinic have a client who gets a probation before judgment, if they do everything they're supposed to do, at the end of that period of time, that becomes a non-conviction. And after 3 years, you can seek to expunge that in Maryland.
And your lawyer would have to request that in order for it to be considered?
You don't need a lawyer to do an expungement in Maryland. It's a pretty straightforward process. You do need $30, and you do need to go to the court where your case was either not just a probation before judgment, but if your case was just dismissed in court. You do need to go and file a petition. A lot of states make it automatic if your case was just outright dismissed, or you get something called a nolle prosequi or a stat. Maryland's not one of those states. So a lot of people have these non-convictions on their record that they might be able to expunge, but they don't know that they have to go and file a petition to do that.
Who do you file a petition with, the clerk?
With the clerk of the district court, or of the court in which...
The court, okay. You go to the court and they file the petition, and once you file it, it's removed on your record automatically?
So it takes a little while, and you have to be eligible. So, you know, I can't really give full legal advice here because it would really depend on the situation and who you're talking to. But just as a general matter, you have to have no convictions that came after the time of the dismissal.
And how about how long, like as in, could you go the next day and file, or do you have to wait a couple of years?
It depends. I know that's a typical answer to many questions you might ask a lawyer. It depends. Like I said, if you have a probation before judgment in Maryland, you will have to wait generally 3 years.
Okay.
If you have just outright dismissal, you come in and the prosecutor says, we're entering a nolle prosequi because we don't have sufficient evidence to go forward in this case, right? Then you can go right down to the clerk's office, and you can file a petition. If you do that, you also have to waive your right to sue the municipality and the police officers. Otherwise, you have to wait 3 years. So it depends on certain things. There is a $30 fee, which is not nothing, especially if a case has been dismissed. And there is also in Maryland's expungement law something I feel like we don't see used enough, which is one little line that says that you can seek an expungement at any time, meaning even before the 3-year waiting period, let's say with a probation before judgment, or if you don't want to waive your right to sue, you can seek one at any time for good cause. So if you have a client who has a job offer that was then withdrawn because they have this record that's still there, to me that is the kind of thing you could take to a judge and say, Your Honor, we think this is good cause because this is blocking this person from doing what we want everyone to be able to do, which is to go out and get a job.
Interesting. Okay. Now let's get into the ban the box, because there are questions. Now, arrests are automatically removed, right?
If it's an arrest that did not lead to any kind of filing in court and it is after 2007, then it's supposed to be automatically expunged, meaning set aside somewhere or really destroyed, but it can just mean being set aside from public view. If it's anything else, if it made it into the court system, you actually have to affirmatively, do something and file, which is, not everyone knows about that. So. Right, so that's, again, it depends on when it is and what it is we're talking about.
Okay. Well, just talking about ban the box, can you explain what ban the box is?
Sure. So ban the box, which is also called fair chance movement, I think different people might call it different things, and they both kind of describe what it is. So banning the box means that you tell employers, as a matter of state law or county law, that you can't put a box on the job application that asks someone if they have an arrest or conviction record. You have to wait. It doesn't mean you can never ask, but you have to wait. And the reason is that there are really interesting studies that show that if somebody with a criminal conviction can just get a face-to-face interview, they have more of a chance of getting a job. And as we talked about earlier in the show, so many people have records now that states and local governments are realizing that we really have to do something to help people get that foot in the door and to basically level the playing field a little bit so there are opportunities. So 13 states, as of the last time I checked, which is, I think, January of 2015, so pretty recently, have some sort of statewide ban the box law. They differ a lot. So Maryland is one of those states, which is great. Maryland's is only for state employment, state government employment.
Oh, so it doesn't apply to private, not yet? Or?
It does not, not yet. Hopefully that will be extended because I think that would be a good move. There are some states, I believe 6 states, cover private employers in a statewide law. Then there are more than 70 municipalities, cities, local governments that have their own ban the box rules, and Montgomery County is one of those, and Baltimore in Maryland. I'm not familiar with Baltimore's law. Montgomery County's does cover private employers.
Okay, interesting. So now, does that mean that if you've been arrested and let's just even go to a more practical question. If you have been arrested, but then your record was expunged. Now, if they ask you, have you been arrested before? Can you say no?
So there's actually a separate provision in Maryland law that bars any employer from asking about an expunged record. And that law does say you can say no.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that's one of the reasons it's important to expunge your record.
Right. So then you don't have that question. So for ban the box regulation, when can they ask about your records?
So right now that inquiry can come after the initial interview. So at the conclusion of the initial interview. Okay. And there are exceptions to the rule. So if you're looking to work in corrections or state law enforcement, as you can imagine, they can ask at an earlier point. I mean, they're not subject generally to these restrictions. So, and I do want to be really clear about one thing. While I think expungement and ban the box rules are very important steps forward in solving this nationwide crisis that we've really created for ourselves of taking people out of the workplace. They're only partial solutions because once a record is created, so you've heard of mugshots.com?
No.
Okay, so I'm using a generic term, but there are a ton of mugshot websites, and if your viewers just go and type in mugshots.com, you can look at the mugshots and the arrest record, essentially the charge of anyone as soon as they're arrested. So these are kind of getting out there.
So the information is already distributed before you can even remove it.
Exactly. And so the trick is what do you do once it's out there? And we probably don't have time to talk about all of it today.
We're going to have you come back on and really get into it. In fact, we're going to wrap this up, and we want to know if someone wants to contact you directly about your work or the clinic, who did they contact? Just let us know.
Sure. So Professor Jenny Roberts at American University, Washington College of Law, and we have a main clinic number, which is 202-274-4140. As I explained, we don't do an open intake in criminal cases, so we would ask people to go to the public defender in Montgomery County. But we do have other clinics that do some intake in other areas, so that number would bring you to our front clinic office.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this very important and helpful information. And I just want to let you all know, if you want to know more about the show or see more videos, you can contact us at chatwiththelawyer@gmail.com, or you can go to our website at www.wallablegay.com. Thank you for joining us.